January 24, 1978, 6:53 a.m., Eastern Standard Time, Great Slave Lake, Northwest Territories, Canada. The morning darkness held temperatures at minus 38 degrees Celsius. Inside the weather station at Fort Reliance, a technician logged routine atmospheric readings. Outside, across frozen tundra stretching 400 miles in every direction, radiation monitors maintained their silent watch. At 6:54 a.m., residents of Yellowknife reported a brilliant white object streaking across the pre-dawn sky. The fireball crossed western Canada in 70 seconds, scattering debris along a 600-kilometer path. By 7:05 a.m., perimeter monitors at multiple stations registered radiation levels of 200 microsieverts per hour, 8 times normal background. Operators expected wintertime baselines. The instruments showed readings consistent with reactor fuel dispersion. By 7:22 a.m., President Jimmy Carter telephoned Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau. A Soviet reconnaissance satellite containing 50 kilograms of weapons-grade uranium-235 had disintegrated over Canadian territory. Operation Morning Light would begin within hours. September 18, 1977, Baikonur Cosmodrome, Kazakhstan. Engineers at the Soviet Ministry of Defense conducted final pre-launch verification checks on Kosmos-954, a reconnaissance satellite designated for polar orbit ocean surveillance. The satellite represented the operational standard of the USA program, a series of radar ocean reconnaissance satellites designed to track NATO naval vessels across the world's oceans. Inside the assembly facility, technicians completed integration tests on the satellite's most critical component, the BES-5 nuclear reactor. The BES-5 reactor weighed less than 400 kilograms, yet generated 100 kilowatts of thermal power, converting approximately 3 kilowatts to usable electrical energy through a liquid sodium-potassium thermionic converter. The reactor core contained 50 kilograms of uranium-235 enriched to over 90% purity, essentially weapons-grade material compressed into uranium carbide pellets the size of ball bearings. These pellets were encased in graphite discs resembling hockey pucks, designed to withstand the extreme conditions of space operations. The high enrichment level allowed the reactor to remain compact and lightweight, critical requirements for orbital deployment. Soviet engineers had designed the BES-5 with specific operational parameters. The reactor would power the satellite's active radar systems, which required substantially more energy than solar panels could provide in the satellite's intended low Earth orbit. At altitudes between 259 and 277 kilometers, atmospheric drag remained significant, and large solar arrays would have created insurmountable control problems. The nuclear solution solved multiple engineering challenges simultaneously, providing reliable power for the radar while maintaining manageable spacecraft dimensions. The reactor assembly included a critical safety feature, an ejection mechanism designed to separate the reactor core from the satellite at mission end, boosting it into a higher disposal orbit approximately 1,000 kilometers above Earth. At that altitude, the radioactive material would remain isolated for approximately 500 years, sufficient time for the most dangerous isotopes to decay to manageable levels. This ejection system represented lessons learned from earlier RORSAT missions, though its reliability remained untested under all failure scenarios. Launch occurred at 13:55 UTC on September 18, 1977. The Cyclone II carrier rocket performed flawlessly, inserting Kosmos-954 into its planned orbit with a 65-degree inclination. The satellite completed one orbit every 89.5 minutes, crossing vast expanses of ocean and positioning its radar to detect surface vessels and submarines. For the first weeks, all systems operated nominally. The reactor maintained steady power output, the radar functioned within specifications, and telemetry confirmed proper thermal management of the reactor's heat. By mid-November, tracking stations detected anomalies. The satellite's orbit showed unexpected variations, with altitude changes of up to 50 miles from the designed parameters. Soviet controllers attempted corrective maneuvers, but the satellite's attitude control system appeared increasingly erratic. By early December, both Soviet and American tracking networks recognized that Kosmos-954 faced a catastrophic malfunction. The critical ejection mechanism designed to safely dispose of the reactor core had failed. Without this system, the satellite and its active nuclear reactor would eventually re-enter Earth's atmosphere together, creating an unprecedented nuclear contamination event. December 19, 1977, Colorado Springs, Colorado. The North American Aerospace Defense Command assigned satellite catalog number 10361 to Kosmos-954 and maintained continuous tracking of its deteriorating orbit. Analysts noted that the satellite's perigee, its closest approach to Earth, was decreasing at an accelerating rate. The orbital mechanics were inexorable. As the satellite descended into denser atmospheric layers, increased drag would accelerate the decay process, creating a feedback loop that would culminate in uncontrolled re-entry within weeks. In mid-December, Soviet officials initiated confidential communications with their American counterparts. In a series of secret meetings, USSR representatives confirmed what Western intelligence had already concluded. They had lost control of Kosmos-954, and the reactor ejection system had malfunctioned. The satellite would re-enter with its nuclear reactor still active. Soviet engineers provided technical specifications, confirming the reactor contained 50 kilograms of uranium-235 and had operated for approximately 4 months, generating substantial quantities of fission products including plutonium-239, cesium-137, and strontium-90. The Soviet Union initially maintained that the reactor would disintegrate completely during re-entry, with any surviving fragments burning up in the atmosphere. This assessment reflected the reactor's designed heat shield and structural characteristics, intended to fragment the uranium carbide pellets into microscopic particles that would disperse harmlessly at high altitude. However, American nuclear experts expressed skepticism. Previous studies of satellite re-entry suggested that substantial fragments could survive the thermal and mechanical stresses of atmospheric passage. By early January 1978, tracking data allowed increasingly precise re-entry predictions. Kosmos-954's orbital inclination of 65 degrees meant the satellite passed over most of Earth's populated regions during each orbit. Every inhabited continent lay beneath its flight path. The uncertainty in predicting the exact re-entry location stemmed from the rapid orbital period and the complex interactions between the satellite and the upper atmosphere. A variation of just minutes in the re-entry time would translate to thousands of kilometers difference in ground impact location. On January 12, 1978, the United States formally approached the Soviet Union requesting detailed technical information about the reactor's design, fuel composition, and potential hazards. 2 days later, the USSR responded with confirmation that the spacecraft had depressurized on January 6th and that the reactor fuel consisted of 50 kilograms of uranium-235. Soviet officials maintained their position that the reactor would disintegrate harmlessly, but they acknowledged the possibility of radioactive debris reaching Earth's surface. This represented the first time the Soviet Union publicly admitted to a potential nuclear contamination event from space. Canadian officials received notification that their territory lay within the probable impact zone. The re-entry corridor included vast stretches of northern Canada, areas characterized by extreme cold, sparse population, and immense distances. Emergency response planning began immediately, though the uncertainty regarding impact location and timing complicated preparations. The Canadian government activated specialized teams and coordinated with American nuclear emergency response organizations, preparing for a contamination event unprecedented in scale and complexity. January 24, 1978, 6:53 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Kosmos-954 entered Earth's atmosphere at an altitude of approximately 100 kilometers above the Queen Charlotte Islands off British Columbia's coast. The satellite began its final descent on a northeastward trajectory across western Canada. Surface temperatures remained brutally cold, with readings across the Northwest Territories registering between -30 and -40 degrees Celsius. The frozen landscape beneath the satellite's path included Great Slave Lake, Baker Lake, and thousands of square kilometers of Arctic and subarctic wilderness. Eyewitnesses across northern Canada reported a brilliant fireball crossing the sky. The satellite's re-entry generated temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Celsius, causing the spacecraft to glow white-hot as it fragmented. The spectacle lasted approximately 70 seconds from initial atmospheric interface until the last visible debris disappeared from view. Residents of Yellowknife, Fort Reliance, and smaller communities watched the celestial display, unaware that they were witnessing the first uncontrolled re-entry of an active nuclear reactor. The fragmentation process scattered debris along a 600-kilometre path stretching from Great Slave Lake northeast toward Baker Lake. The trajectory crossed portions of the Northwest Territories, the region that would later become Nunavut, northern Alberta, and Saskatchewan. The debris field covered approximately 124,000 square kilometres, an area larger than many European nations. Some fragments remained large and intact, while others fragmented into microscopic particles. The uranium carbide pellets, designed to withstand the intense environment inside the reactor, proved remarkably resistant to the thermal and mechanical forces of re-entry. At 7:15 a.m., 22 minutes after re-entry, President Jimmy Carter contacted Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau. The brief conversation confirmed what Canadian authorities already suspected from preliminary tracking data. Kosmos-954 had impacted Canadian territory. The United States immediately offered assistance in locating and recovering radioactive debris, an offer Canada accepted without hesitation. Both nations recognized that the recovery operation would require resources and expertise beyond the capability of any single country. Within hours, radiation monitoring stations across northern Canada began reporting elevated readings. At Fort Reliance, located approximately 100 kilometers north of Yellowknife on the eastern shore of Great Slave Lake, monitors registered radiation levels significantly above background. Initial readings ranged from 100 to 200 microsieverts per hour, compared to typical background levels of 0.1 to 0.2 microsieverts per hour. These readings confirmed that radioactive material had indeed survived re-entry and contaminated the surface. The Canadian Forces Nuclear Accident Support Team received activation orders at 8:30 a.m. 22 personnel from Canadian Forces Base Edmonton prepared for immediate deployment to Yellowknife. The team included radiation safety officers, health physicists, and military logistics specialists. Their mission parameters remained uncertain. They would need to locate radioactive debris across an area the size of England under Arctic winter conditions, with temperatures cold enough to kill an unprotected person in minutes. The operational name assigned to the mission reflected both urgency and uncertainty: Operation Morning Light. January 24, 1978 afternoon, Yellowknife, Northwest Territories. The first contingent of Operation Morning Light personnel arrived at Yellowknife Airport as winter darkness fell at 4:30 p.m. The city, with a population of approximately 10,000, served as the territorial capital and would become the operational headquarters for what would evolve into one of the largest nuclear emergency responses in history. The advance team faced immediate challenges: sub-zero temperatures, limited daylight, vast distances, and the fundamental problem of locating radioactive fragments across terrain that resisted even basic navigation. Within 48 hours, the operation expanded dramatically. The United States deployed the Nuclear Emergency Search Team, a specialized unit of the Department of Energy comprising 120 personnel trained in radiation detection and nuclear accident response. The combined Canadian-American force would eventually include hundreds of military personnel, scientists, technicians, and support staff. Aircraft from both nations converged on Yellowknife: helicopters for close-range surveys, fixed-wing aircraft equipped with sophisticated gamma-ray spectrometers, and transport planes carrying supplies and equipment. The Geological Survey of Canada contributed critical expertise. For over a decade, survey scientists had developed and operated airborne gamma-ray spectrometers for uranium prospecting and geological mapping. These instruments could detect naturally occurring radioactive minerals from aircraft flying at low altitude. The survey's experience in Arctic operations proved invaluable. Scientists understood the challenges of operating sensitive electronic equipment at extreme temperatures and had developed protocols for conducting systematic aerial surveys over trackless wilderness. On January 26th, 2 days after re-entry, a survey aircraft equipped with gamma-ray spectrometers conducted the first systematic aerial survey. At 2:15 p.m., flying at 300 meters above the frozen surface of Great Slave Lake, the instruments detected a sharp radiation signature approximately 43 kilometers northwest of Fort Reliance. The pilots circled to confirm the reading. Instruments recorded levels exceeding 500 microsieverts per hour, more than 2,000 times normal background radiation. Ground teams deployed immediately, traveling across the ice by snowmobile. The recovery team found the first major piece of debris partially embedded in ice. The fragment measured approximately 18 kilograms, making it the largest single piece that would be recovered during the entire operation. Close-range readings registered 200 millisieverts per hour, enough to deliver a dangerous radiation dose in just hours. The team used specialized handling equipment to extract the fragment from the ice and placed it in a lead-lined container for transport to Yellowknife. Analysis would later identify the piece as part of the reactor's structural assembly, heavily contaminated with activation products from neutron exposure during the reactor's operational period. The discovery validated the operational concept and provided the first solid data about debris characteristics. Recovery teams now understood they were searching for fragments ranging from kilogram-sized pieces visible from aircraft to microscopic particles requiring ground-based instruments to detect. The debris distribution followed no simple pattern. Some areas showed concentrated contamination, while adjacent sectors registered only background levels. The erratic distribution reflected the chaotic nature of the satellite's disintegration and the subsequent dispersal of fragments across hundreds of kilometers, late January through February 1978. As aerial surveys expanded, the true scale of contamination became apparent. Aircraft equipped with gamma-ray spectrometers flew systematic grid patterns across 124,000 square kilometers of northern Canada. The survey area encompassed territory roughly equivalent to the size of England. Pilots flew at altitudes between 100 and 300 meters, the minimum height at which instruments could discriminate radioactive signatures from background cosmic radiation, while maintaining safe separation from terrain in poor visibility conditions. Flight crews worked 12-hour shifts in temperatures that frequently dropped below -40 degrees Celsius. Aircraft engines required special cold weather modifications. Fuel lines needed heating elements to prevent fuel from gelling. Hydraulic systems incorporated low-temperature fluids. Even with these modifications, equipment failures remained common. An aircraft's instruments might indicate contamination, but ground teams arriving at the coordinates would find nothing. False positives resulted from equipment malfunctions, cosmic ray hits on detectors, or naturally occurring radioactive minerals in the underlying geology. By mid-February, recovery teams had located and documented dozens of significant radioactive sources. One fragment, measuring merely 2 millimeters in diameter, registered contact radiation levels of 500 roentgens per hour. This microscopic piece, approximately the size of a pinhead, contained sufficient radioactivity to deliver a lethal dose to an unprotected person within hours. The fragment consisted of uranium carbide, one of the reactor's fuel pellets that had survived re-entry intact. Its small size made detection difficult, yet its radioactive intensity created a severe hazard to anyone who might accidentally encounter it. The radiation levels varied dramatically across the debris field. Some areas showed only modest elevation above background, while others presented acute hazards. The highest readings came from pieces that had been part of the reactor core itself. These fragments contained not only the original uranium-235 fuel, but also fission products generated during the reactor's 4-month operational period. Cesium-137, with a half-life of 30 years, represented the most persistent long-term hazard. Strontium-90, another long-lived fission product, posed particular biological risks because the human body can mistake it for calcium and incorporate it into bone tissue. Ground recovery teams faced extraordinary operational challenges. Teams deployed in 12-hour shifts, working in conditions that tested the limits of human endurance and equipment reliability. Portable radiation detectors required battery changes every few hours in the extreme cold. Protective clothing, necessary to prevent contamination, created additional thermal stress on personnel who already struggled with the Arctic environment. Navigation proved difficult across terrain that lacked distinctive features. Whiteout conditions could develop without warning, reducing visibility to meters and forcing teams to halt operations until weather improved. The recovery protocol required meticulous documentation. Teams recorded GPS coordinates, radiation readings, fragment size and appearance, and photographic documentation of each piece before collection. Fragments went into numbered containers, with detailed chain of custody records maintained from point of collection through laboratory analysis. This documentation served multiple purposes, ensuring nothing was lost or misidentified, providing data for subsequent scientific analysis, and establishing the evidentiary record for potential legal claims against the Soviet Union. February through March 1978. Whiteshell Laboratories, Manitoba. The Atomic Energy Control Board designated Whiteshell Laboratories as the lead facility for analyzing recovered debris. Scientists established dedicated laboratory space for handling highly radioactive materials, implementing protocols that prevented cross-contamination between samples while protecting laboratory personnel from radiation exposure. Each fragment received comprehensive analysis: gamma spectroscopy to identify radioactive isotopes, mass spectrometry to determine uranium enrichment levels, and metallurgical examination to understand structural composition. The isotopic analysis revealed sobering details about the reactor's operational history. Scientists identified uranium-235 enriched to over 90%, confirming the weapons-grade character of the reactor fuel. More significantly, they detected substantial quantities of fission products and transuranics that only form during reactor operation. Cesium-137 appeared in ratios consistent with approximately 4 months of reactor operation at design power levels. Strontium-90 concentrations matched theoretical predictions for burnup in a fast neutron spectrum reactor. The presence of plutonium-239 confirmed neutron capture reactions had occurred in the uranium-238 component of the reactor fuel. One discovery particularly concerned analysts. Several recovered fragments showed evidence of incomplete combustion during reentry. The uranium carbide composition, chosen for its high melting point and structural stability, had performed exactly as designed. However, this same stability meant that fuel pellets survived atmospheric passage largely intact. A fragment recovered near Baker Lake contained uranium carbide with minimal oxidation or structural damage. The pellet had descended through the atmosphere, experiencing temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees, and emerged essentially unchanged, except for minor surface ablation. Scientists calculated the total quantity of fissile material that had reached the surface. Based on recovered samples and aerial survey data, they estimated that approximately 10% of the reactor's uranium had been collected. The remaining 45 kilograms presumably dispersed as microscopic particles across the survey area and beyond, settling onto the snow and ice in concentrations too low for individual detection, but collectively representing a significant environmental contamination burden. Health physicists projected long-term exposure pathways. Radioactive particles could enter the food chain through caribou and fish, presenting chronic exposure risks to indigenous populations who depended on traditional food sources. Metallurgical analysis of structural components provided insights into Soviet reactor design. One large fragment proved to be part of the reactor's radiation shield, constructed from lithium hydride and stainless steel with tungsten and uranium alloy supplementation. The shielding configuration suggested the Soviets had optimized the design for minimum mass, while providing adequate protection for satellite electronics. The engineering was sophisticated, representing years of development in compact nuclear power systems. American analysts gained valuable intelligence about Soviet space nuclear technology, intelligence that would inform future assessments of USSR capabilities. March through April 1978. Northern communities faced unprecedented uncertainty about environmental contamination and health risks. The affected region included traditional territories of Dene, Métis, and Inuit peoples who maintained subsistence lifestyles dependent on hunting, fishing, and gathering. For these communities, government assurances about acceptable radiation levels carried less weight than the observable fact that hundreds of military personnel in protective equipment were scouring the landscape for radioactive debris. Health physicists conducted systematic surveys of inhabited areas. All communities within the debris field received ground-level radiation surveys, with particular attention to areas where people congregated: schools, trading posts, and community centers. Surveys also included traditional hunting and fishing areas. The assessments generally showed radiation levels only marginally above background in populated areas, primarily because the debris had scattered across unpopulated wilderness. However, localized hotspots existed where, Fragments had landed near trails or within hunting territories. Government officials faced the challenge of communicating radiation risks to populations separated by language and cultural barriers. Many northern residents spoke Dene or Inuktitut as first languages, requiring translation of technical information about radiation exposure, contamination pathways, and protective measures. Officials attempted to convey that while the overall health risk remained low, certain behaviors could increase exposure, consuming caribou or fish from affected areas, handling unusual metallic objects found on the land, or allowing children to play in areas where aerial surveys had detected contamination. The operation's presence created its own stresses on northern communities. Yellowknife transformed almost overnight from a quiet territorial capital into a busy military logistics hub. Hotels filled with recovery personnel, aircraft noise disrupted normal routines, and the constant activity of helicopters and ground vehicles altered the rhythm of daily life. Some community members worked as guides and local experts, helping southern personnel navigate unfamiliar terrain and understand northern conditions. This participation provided income, but also created conflicting feelings about profiting from a nuclear contamination event. Search teams received strict instructions to avoid alarming local populations. Personnel were forbidden from entering settlements wearing protective equipment or carrying obvious radiation detection devices. Operations were planned to minimize visible presence near communities. These protocols attempted to prevent panic, but they also contributed to mistrust. Residents observed aircraft conducting surveys overhead and military vehicles traveling traditional routes, yet received only limited information about what was being found or where contamination existed. Medical monitoring programs were established for personnel who had spent extended periods in the debris field. Recovery team members received individual dosimetry badges that tracked cumulative radiation exposure. No team member exceeded established dose limits, though several individuals working with highly contaminated fragments received exposures equivalent to several years of natural background radiation compressed into weeks. Long-term medical follow-up protocols were instituted, recognizing that some health effects of radiation exposure might not manifest for years or decades. February through April 1978. While recovery operations continued in Canada's north, diplomatic exchanges between Ottawa, Moscow, and Washington established the legal and financial framework for addressing the incident. Canada invoked the 1972 Convention on International Liability for Damage Caused by Space Objects, which established that launching states bear absolute liability for damage caused by their space objects. The convention provided clear legal grounds for Canadian claims, but the unprecedented nature of the incident meant that many practical questions lacked established precedents. Canadian officials submitted detailed requests to the Soviet Union for technical information about the reactor's design, fuel composition, and operational history. These requests went to Moscow on January 24th, immediately after re-entry. Follow-up requests on January 27th, February 8th, and April 13th sought additional clarification on points the Soviets had not addressed in initial responses. The USSR provided some technical data confirming the reactor type, uranium quantity, and enrichment level. However, key details about reactor physics, control systems, and the ejection mechanism failure remained classified. The incomplete Soviet cooperation reflected Cold War security concerns. The BES-5 reactor represented sensitive military technology, and detailed disclosure would have revealed capabilities and limitations that the USSR preferred to keep confidential. From the Soviet perspective, they had acknowledged responsibility and provided sufficient information for health and safety assessments. Requests for additional engineering details appeared to exceed legitimate recovery needs and seemed designed to extract intelligence about Soviet space nuclear systems. The international response to Kosmos-954 galvanized policy discussions about nuclear power in space. The United States, which had launched nuclear-powered satellites since 1961, called for international restrictions on space nuclear systems. European nations supported this position, arguing that the risks of radioactive contamination from satellite failures outweighed the benefits of nuclear power for space applications. The incident demonstrated that orbital mechanics respected no national boundaries. A satellite launched from Kazakhstan could contaminate Canada, and the next failure might affect any nation on Earth. In November 1978, the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space established a working group to study nuclear-powered satellites. The working group examined technical safety measures, notification requirements, and liability frameworks. Discussions revealed fundamental disagreements between spacefaring nations about acceptable risk levels. Some advocated for complete prohibition of nuclear systems in Earth orbit, while others argued that nuclear power remained essential for certain mission types, particularly those requiring high power levels at orbital altitudes where solar power proved impractical. April 20th, 1978. Operation Morning Light's first phase concluded after 117 days of continuous operations. Spring breakup approached across northern Canada, creating conditions that would make further recovery operations impossible. The frozen surfaces that had allowed ground teams to traverse lakes and wetlands would soon become impassable water. Ice roads would disintegrate. The landscape would transform from a frozen platform suitable for heavy equipment into a seasonal swamp, accessible only by helicopter or boat. The operational statistics documented an extraordinary effort. Aircraft had logged more than 4,500 hours of survey time, flying systematic grid patterns across 124,000 square kilometers. Ground teams had investigated thousands of potential radiation sources identified by aerial surveys. Recovery personnel had collected and documented 3,156 separate pieces of radioactive debris, ranging from the 18-kilogram structural fragment found on Great Slave Lake to microscopic particles barely visible to the naked eye. All inhabited areas had been surveyed and cleared, including the sites prepared for the 1978 Arctic Winter Games in Hay River and Pine Point. Laboratory analysis of recovered materials had identified 12 major structural components from the satellite. 10 of these large pieces showed significant radioactive contamination, confirming they had been part of the reactor assembly or had been exposed to neutron flux during reactor operations. The largest pieces displayed radioactivity levels up to 1.1 sieverts per hour, intensities that would deliver a potentially fatal radiation dose in less than 5 hours of close-range exposure. Yet these substantial fragments represented only an estimated 1% of the reactor's original uranium fuel mass. The disparity between recovered material and theoretical fuel inventory troubled scientists and officials. Simple mass balance calculations indicated that approximately 49 kilograms of uranium-235 had not been recovered. Aerial surveys had detected hundreds of smaller sources that ground teams had not yet reached, but the aggregate mass of these additional fragments seemed unlikely to account for the missing fuel. Scientists concluded that substantial quantities of reactor fuel had disintegrated into particles too small and too widely dispersed for detection and recovery. Health physicists modeled the environmental dispersion of this unrecovered material. Uranium particles in the micrometer to submicrometer range would have settled slowly through the atmosphere, descending over hours or days rather than minutes. Atmospheric winds during and after the reentry could have transported these particles hundreds of kilometers from the primary debris field. The particles would have landed on snow and ice across northern Canada, creating a diffuse contamination pattern at concentrations below detection thresholds, but collectively representing a long-term environmental burden. As Phase 1 concluded, planners developed protocols for Phase 2 operations that would resume after spring breakup and continue through the brief Arctic summer. The second phase would focus on areas inaccessible during winter, wetlands, riversides, and the shorelines of lakes that had been frozen during Phase 1. Additionally, Phase 2 would include systematic surveys of seasonal wildlife habitat, particularly the whooping crane nesting grounds in Wood Buffalo National Park, recognizing that radioactive contamination could affect endangered species populations. July through October 1978. The second phase of Operation Morning Light operated under a contracted arrangement coordinated by the Atomic Energy Control Board. The operational tempo decreased from Phase 1's intensive military deployment, but the work's technical challenges intensified. Summer conditions in the Arctic and subarctic presented different obstacles than winter operations. Insects, particularly blackflies and mosquitoes, plagued field teams. The brief northern summer created compressed timelines. operations had to conclude before autumn freeze-up and the onset of polar winter conditions. Phase 2 concentrated on 3 priority objectives. First, complete surveys of areas that had been snow-covered or inaccessible during winter. Second, conduct detailed ground surveys in locations where aerial detection indicated possible contamination, but where winter conditions had prevented thorough investigation. Third, perform specialized surveys of ecologically sensitive areas, including wildlife migration routes, nesting areas, and traditional food-gathering sites used by indigenous communities. The whooping crane nesting areas in Wood Buffalo National Park received particular attention. These endangered birds, numbering fewer than 100 individuals in the wild, bred exclusively in remote wetlands straddling the Northwest Territories and Alberta border. The cranes migrated annually between northern nesting grounds and wintering habitat along the Texas Gulf Coast. Contamination of their nesting territory could have catastrophic population effects. Survey teams conducted systematic coverage of known nesting areas, documenting that contamination levels remained within acceptable limits for wildlife habitat. By mid-October 1978, Phase 2 teams had identified and recovered an additional 844 pieces of radioactive debris. Laboratory analysis of these fragments showed similar characteristics to Phase 1 materials: uranium carbide fuel pellets, reactor structural components, and spacecraft materials that had been activated through neutron exposure. The combined recovery effort had now collected more than 4,000 separate pieces, totaling approximately 65 kilograms. Yet this represented only about 13% of the satellite's estimated pre-reentry mass of 4,000 kilograms. The decision to conclude active recovery operations came in mid-October. Approaching winter would soon make further field work impossible. More fundamentally, the incremental return on continued searching appeared to reach diminishing returns. Teams were now finding fragments only occasionally, despite systematic coverage of remaining unsurveyed territory. The most accessible and most radioactive materials had been recovered. Additional fragments undoubtedly remained scattered across the landscape, but locating them would require disproportionate effort with decreasing likelihood of success. The final operational statistics documented one of history's most extensive environmental remediation efforts. More than 4,700 separate laboratory analyses had been completed. The total financial cost to Canadian government departments and agencies involved in Phase 1 alone reached 12 million Canadian dollars, though this figure excluded contributed resources from the United States and did not capture the full economic impact on northern communities. The operation had successfully removed all major radioactive sources from inhabited and seasonally inhabited areas, reducing the health risk to acceptable levels. November 1978 and beyond. The conclusion of active recovery operations marked a transition rather than an ending. Approximately 87% of Kosmos-954's mass remained unrecovered, dispersed across northern Canada in forms ranging from substantial fragments to molecular-level contamination. Scientists and government officials recognized that this residual contamination required ongoing monitoring and that potential health effects might not manifest for decades. Environmental monitoring protocols established permanent sampling stations across the affected region. These stations collected air, water, soil, and biological samples on regular schedules, analyzing them for radioactive isotopes associated with Kosmos-954 debris. Of particular concern were the long-lived fission products cesium-137 and strontium-90. With half-lives of approximately 30 years, these isotopes would remain environmentally significant throughout the 21st century. Their presence in biological samples would indicate ongoing contamination entering food chains. A 1984 atmospheric analysis revealed disturbing evidence of widespread dispersion. Air samples collected at altitudes between 27 and 36 kilometers showed that approximately 45 kilograms of uranium-235 from Kosmos-954 had dispersed into the stratosphere. This airborne component had scattered globally, carried by high-altitude winds across continents and oceans. Ground-level measurements in Fayetteville, Arkansas, detected radioactive strontium-89 in rainwater samples. Isotopic analysis confirmed the material originated from Kosmos-954. The reactor's disintegration had created not merely a local contamination event, but a global, albeit dilute, dispersion of radioactive material. For indigenous communities in the affected region, the psychological and cultural impacts of contamination proved as significant as measurable radiation exposure. Traditional knowledge about the land, passed through generations, suddenly seemed inadequate. Could caribou from traditional hunting grounds be safely consumed? Were fish from Great Slave Lake contaminated? Government assurances about acceptable risk levels conflicted with the observable fact that government personnel had spent months removing radioactive material from the territory. Trust in official communications eroded, creating a legacy of skepticism about government statements regarding environmental safety. Decades later, health studies would document elevated cancer rates in some communities within the debris field, though establishing definitive causal links to Kosmos-954 contamination remained scientifically challenging. Cancer has multiple causes, and distinguishing radiation effects from other risk factors in small population samples approaches statistical impossibility. However, the temporal correlation between the satellite crash and subsequent health outcomes sustained community concerns about long-term contamination effects. Individual stories emerged of people whose lives intersected directly with the contamination. A Royal Canadian Mounted Police officer who served guard duty over recovered debris was later diagnosed with a rare malignant tumour. Former employees of the Fort Reliance weather station, which lay near the centre of the debris field, questioned whether their occupational exposure might have contributed to subsequent health problems. These individual cases, while scientifically inconclusive, personalise the abstract statistics of radiation dose and risk assessment. March 15, 1979. The Canadian government formally submitted its claim to the Soviet Union under the 1972 Convention on International Liability for Damage caused by space objects. The claim totaled $6 million Canadian dollars, itemising costs incurred during Operation Morning Light and requesting additional compensation for future unpredicted expenses. The claim included detailed documentation, operational logs, financial records, scientific reports, and photographic evidence of debris recovery operations. Canada's claim emphasised several key points. First, the Soviet Union had failed to respond adequately to Canadian requests for technical information, complicating recovery efforts and potentially endangering personnel. Questions submitted on January 24, 27, February 8th, and April 13th regarding the reactor's design and the nature of debris remained only partially answered. Second, all recovered debris except 2 pieces were radioactive, with some fragments displaying lethal radiation levels. Third, inscriptions in Cyrillic alphabet on recovered materials definitively established Soviet origin. Fourth, the cleanup operations represented Canada's reasonable efforts to mitigate damage caused by Soviet actions. The Soviet response arrived on May 31, 1978, before Canada had submitted its formal claim. The USSR acknowledged responsibility but disputed certain characterizations. Soviet officials maintained that they had provided all technical information relevant to health and safety concerns, arguing that additional engineering details requested by Canada exceeded legitimate recovery needs and amounted to intelligence gathering. They also noted that the satellite's reentry had been involuntary, resulting from technical malfunction rather than negligence, though they acknowledged this did not absolve liability under the Space Liability Convention. Negotiations between Canada and the USSR proceeded through diplomatic channels over 2 years. The discussions addressed not only financial compensation, but also precedent-setting interpretations of space law. How should costs for environmental monitoring be calculated? What compensation was appropriate for economic disruption to northern communities? Could Canada claim compensation for psychological harm to populations concerned about radiation exposure? The Convention's language provided general principles, but left many practical questions open to interpretation. On April 6, 1981, Canada and the Soviet Union signed a protocol of agreement in Moscow. The USSR agreed to pay $3 million Canadian dollars, exactly half of Canada's claimed amount. The settlement included provisions that Canada could submit additional claims for future expenses resulting from Kosmos-954 contamination. Both parties agreed the settlement represented full resolution of claims related to immediate recovery costs, but acknowledged potential future liabilities for long-term environmental effects or health impacts that might emerge over subsequent decades. The settlement established important legal precedent. It represented the first application of the Space Liability Convention to an actual damage claim involving a nuclear-powered spacecraft. The negotiation process and final agreement provided template language and procedural frameworks that could guide future incidents involving space debris damage. Perhaps most significantly, the settlement validated the principle that launching states bear financial responsibility for damage caused by their spacecraft, regardless of whether the failure resulted from negligence or unforeseeable technical malfunction. The Kosmos-954 incident fundamentally altered international attitudes toward nuclear power in space. The dramatic demonstration that radioactive contamination could scatter across sovereign territory galvanized policy discussions that had previously remained largely theoretical. Both the United States and Soviet Union modified their space nuclear programs in response to lessons learned from the satellite's failure and the subsequent recovery operation. The most immediate change affected Soviet RORSAT satellites. After Kosmos-954, engineers redesigned the reactor ejection system, adding redundant backup mechanisms. When Kosmos-1402, another nuclear-powered reconnaissance satellite, malfunctioned in 1982, the primary ejection system failed. However, the newly installed secondary system functioned as designed, successfully separating the reactor core and boosting it to a safe disposal orbit. The core re-entered separately in February 1983, disintegrating over the South Atlantic Ocean. While radioactive material still reached Earth's atmosphere, the separated re-entry prevented the comprehensive contamination event that had occurred with Kosmos-954. The United States, which had launched nuclear-powered satellites since 1961, reassessed its own space nuclear systems. The Transit Navigation Satellite Program, which had included several nuclear-powered spacecraft, transitioned entirely to solar power. The SNAP-10A reactor, which had operated briefly in orbit in 1965, remained aloft but inactive. American space planners concluded that solar power technology had advanced sufficiently to meet most orbital power requirements, making nuclear systems unnecessary for Earth-orbiting satellites despite their theoretical advantages for high-power applications. The Soviet Union continued launching nuclear-powered RORSAT satellites through 1988, though at a reduced pace compared to the pre-1978 period. The final Soviet space nuclear reactor was launched aboard Kosmos-932 in March 1988. After this mission, the USSR discontinued the program entirely. The decision reflected multiple factors: improved solar panel efficiency, changing reconnaissance priorities, international pressure for nuclear safety in space, and the economic strains of the late Soviet period. The BES-5 reactor design, developed over decades at substantial cost, became obsolete not through technical inadequacy, but through geopolitical transformation. In 1992, the United Nations General Assembly adopted principles relevant to the use of nuclear power sources in outer space. These principles codified safety guidelines influenced directly by Kosmos-954 lessons. The document recommended that space nuclear systems include redundant safety features, that launching states notify other nations of nuclear-powered missions, and that designers minimize radioactive inventory through careful engineering. While not legally binding, the principles established international norms that spacefaring nations generally respected. Contemporary space programs employ nuclear power primarily for deep space missions, where solar energy proves impractical. The Mars, Curiosity, and Perseverance rovers use radioisotope thermoelectric generators, devices that generate electricity from radioactive decay heat without requiring fission reactions. These systems contain substantially less radioactive material than the BES-5 reactor and are designed to survive re-entry intact if mission failures force premature return. The Voyager spacecraft, traveling through interstellar space, rely on similar radioisotope systems that have functioned reliably for decades. Operation Morning Light also contributed lasting improvements to nuclear emergency response capabilities. The collaboration between Canadian and American teams established protocols for international cooperation in radiation incidents. Equipment developed for Arctic operations in extreme cold proved valuable in subsequent nuclear accidents. The airborne gamma-ray spectrometry techniques, refined during debris surveys, found applications in environmental monitoring and nuclear safeguards verification. Personnel, who gained experience during the recovery operation, became instructors and mentors, transferring knowledge to subsequent generations of radiation safety professionals. Approximately 30 defunct Soviet nuclear reactors remain in orbit, silent reminders of Cold War space programs. These reactors, boosted to disposal orbits hundreds of kilometers above active satellite zones, will remain aloft for centuries. Eventually, orbital perturbations will cause some to re-enter Earth's atmosphere. Contemporary space agencies monitor these objects, calculating re-entry predictions and preparing response plans should another uncontrolled descent occur. The institutional memory of Kosmos-954 ensures that the international community maintains awareness of persistent orbital hazards decades after the original incident. In the Canadian North, the landscape holds its secrets. Fragments of Kosmos-954 remain embedded in permafrost, buried in lake sediments, scattered across tundra that few humans traverse. Isotopic signatures of cesium-137 and strontium-90 persist in environmental samples, faint but detectable evidence of January 24, 1978. The Dene, Métis and Inuit communities who watched fire fall from space maintain their relationship with the land, carrying knowledge of contamination alongside traditional ecological understanding. Government monitoring stations continue collecting samples, documenting the gradual radioactive decay that will span lifetimes. The half-life of cesium-137 extends to 2038, then 2068, marking time in 30-year increments. Operation Morning Light recovered 65 kilograms of debris from a 4,000-kilogram spacecraft. The remainder dispersed across continents, settled into oceans, incorporated into ice cores that will preserve isotopic evidence for millennia. What began as a satellite malfunction became an international incident, a nuclear emergency response, a diplomatic negotiation, and ultimately a transformation of space policy that continues influencing decisions made aboard space stations orbiting overhead. The incident established precedent. Space activities carry terrestrial consequences, technology failures respect no borders, and the legacy of nuclear contamination extends far beyond immediate cleanup operations. These lessons, learned across frozen Canadian wilderness during the darkest months of 1978, remain relevant as humanity expands its presence beyond Earth. The recovered debris resides in secure storage at Canadian government facilities, periodically examined by researchers studying long-term material degradation under radiation exposure. The largest fragment, that 18-kilogram piece pulled from Great Slave Lake ice on January 26, 1978, remains the tangible connection to an event that scattered radioactive material across a territory larger than many nations. Above, satellites continue their silent orbits, some carrying nuclear power sources, some monitoring Earth's environment, all subject to the same orbital mechanics and atmospheric forces that brought Kosmos-954 down. The northern lights dance across Arctic skies, natural phenomena older than human civilization, indifferent to the radioactive artifacts embedded in the frozen landscape below. The land endures, the contamination persists, the memory remains documented in operational reports, scientific analyses, and stories told in northern communities where the sky briefly burned with nuclear fire.